She thought she was sending it to Sophia. It was supposed to be private. The curve of her collarbone caught in late afternoon light, the hint of a sultry smile that was more bravado than truth. Elena had paused over the send button for a long second, thumb hovering because the camera had caught something she liked about herself for the first time in months. She tapped. The little gray bubble turned blue. Delivered. Her phone vibrated before she could even set it down. For a full, terrible second, she imagined Sophia already screeching, emoji after emoji. Then she read the name in the message thread and felt the world tilt. Duca. 7 messages poured out of her with the clumsy rhythm of panic. Sorry, wrong thread. God, no. Delete. Please don't open it. I'm so sorry. I'm such an idiot. She pressed send on each one as if force could rewind a mistake. He replied once. Interesting choice of lighting. It arrived like a brick, small and precise and very, very calm. There was no laughter in it, no emoji, no sign of the amusement she'd expected in Sophia. The words were dry, almost academic, and they stabbed the way cold did when winter sat in the bones. Elena stared at the sentence until the letters blurred. Her chest tightened, sharp and immediate, fear braided with a ridiculous heat-tinged curiosity. Duca. Matteo Duca. Once, when she'd been gossiping with Sophia about men who looked like they'd been carved out of marble and taught how to be private, she had said the name like it was a movie. Now the name felt like a place, a penthouse, a man who moved in rooms where people didn't make careless mistakes. She imagined, absurdly, Matteo sitting at some glossy table in an office that smelled of leather and citrus, watching his phone and thinking about light. The image made her palms sweat. She shrank into the cramped back room of the cafe where she worked, the place where the espresso machine hissed like a sleeping animal and the smell of burnt sugar always lingered in the grout. Milo, her disinterested gray cat, who lived with her in a small apartment up 3 flights, would not have approved of any of this. He was currently inside his cardboard box with the posture of a monarch who had suffered fools for half his life. Elena read the reply again, then again. The world did its funny thing where sound seemed distant and slow, and she felt absurdly like she was holding her breath to avoid making the situation worse. Across town, the penthouse windows looked like a single dark eye. Inside, Matteo Duca's meeting had dragged on with the kind of patient precision he expected from everything around him. A line item about fuel shipments, a quarrel someone had had in another man's name. He let the others chatter and watch them. He liked the clarity of facts, the prospect of a piece that could be solved by a single decision. Then his phone lit up, a small blue bubble framed by a thread labeled Duca. He didn't like names reduced like that. He clicked and saw the image. It wasn't explicit. There was always a discipline to what one watched when one had to look at too many people, but it was intimate. A shoulder, a slanted smile, something so ordinary and so daring all at once. Matteo found himself studying the lighting like a curator. He could have ignored it, he told himself. He had ignored worse, provocations wrapped in worse things than a misdirected photo. He had made people suffer by making them wait. He liked the quiet arithmetic of control. Instead, he ordered a background check. He asked Vince to pull what he could, the basics, their usual sweep for someone who might be more interesting than their public face suggested. Vince sent back a thumbnail and a name, Elena Racy, 26. Barista, occasional photography gigs. Apartment in the East Village. No known connections to anyone worth his attention. No arrests. A cat registered under a pet license. Small things. Patterns. Human heat. Matteo did not intend for the encounter to become anything, but curiosity is not always a thing one intends. It has the smell of inevitability when allowed to breathe.
Elena closed the cafe that night with the same care she always did. Silverware in the cutlery drawer, the squeak of the delivery door, coffee grounds swept into a weathered tin. Sophia texted a stream of flames and laughing faces that only fed her mortification. She told herself to breathe. Milo, when she slipped in at midnight, wound around her ankles and demanded food with the same blithe sense of entitlement he had for years. She tried to forget it by washing dishes and then telling herself off in the mirror. But sleep, when it finally found her, was thin. Her dreams were a series of slightly ridiculous tableaux of the penthouse and her shoulder exposed to chandeliers. The card came the next morning. It wasn't left like a threat. The courier had the same careful distance as a man delivering a message to someone he'd like to keep alive for reasons he hadn't yet admitted to himself. Elena found it tucked between the tip jar and the stack of monthly menus, in the quiet lull after the breakfast rush. The card was heavy and thick, dark as if swallowed whole. Her name was printed in a hand that was not ornamental, but decisive. Elena Racy. A simple address in the city, a time, no more. For a moment, she did not move. Babies cried outside. The day began to congeal into a workable rhythm. Patrons lined up for the morning espresso. Sophia's voice rose behind the counter, untroubled as a bell. Elena held the card like something that might explode. She did not tell her mother. There was no one else to call who would understand without adding a touch of hysteria she didn't want. She folded the card and put it under the little jar where she kept spare change. It felt obscene and necessary both. Elena had choices. She had lived on choice enough to know the feel of it. She could walk away. She could file the card into a drawer that held unpaid bills and broken Polaroids, choose the familiar routines of coffee times and night photography courses. She could be practical and maintain a life small enough to be safe. But curiosity is another kind of gravity. The photo had been a mistake, and it had also been a voice that had called her name. She didn't like men who made her small. She didn't like people who made decisions for her. And yet the card suggested an invitation, not an order. She chose to go. Stay tuned. If you like stories where ordinary gets complicated, hit subscribe. It was a ridiculous, small thing to think, and the voice that suggested it was the narrator of 1,000 internet teasers. She smiled despite herself, the kind of private grin that always had one corner higher than the other, like a quirk in a photograph. The world remained ridiculous. Her feet found the route she always took from the cafe to Midtown, and she moved through it with an odd, ironical grace. The arrival at the address was unostentatious for a building that had very little use for modesty. A nondescript entrance, a doorman with the careful neutrality of someone trained to be invisible, a lift that smelt faintly of lemon and old money. Upstairs, the doors opened onto a corridor that looked like the inside of a reserved thought. Marble, plants that had undoubtedly been moved every week and returned to the exact same angle. An art piece she could not name but would have recognized as expensive. He met her in the foyer. He did not come with the full weight of menace she had mentally prepared for. He came like a man who knew the language of interruption and had chosen a gentle one. He wore charcoal, a simple shirt open at the collar. His hair held the sort of discipline that had to be maintained by either vanity or necessity. When he smiled, brief, precise, something in her loosened. "Ms. Racy," he said, and the name sounded strange in the space. "You have a good eye for light." There was a place between his words where the photo had lived and where she stood now. She braced herself for the remainder of his day, the questions, the insinuations, the quiet statements of the sort men like him were used to making without being asked. Instead, he offered her water and didn't hover. They talked like two people doing a strange dance, where each tried to learn the other's terms. He asked about her camera, about the places she liked to photograph. He wasn't invasive, he was curious in a rare, measured way that didn't make her want to bolt. Elena asked about his work because that was where the conversation landed. And he answered with the sort of guarded honesty that hinted at a life in tight compartments. He said nothing of threats. He said nothing of his network. He asked about the way she composed light. "How much would you charge to shoot a portrait for someone I care about?"
He asked abruptly, different than the way other men had asked questions that were actually requests. "Depends," she said. "Who is someone you care about, exactly?" "Someone I haven't met yet," Mateo said, "but I'd like to get it right." There was an offer in the room, a policy and a promise shaped like work. It was practical and risky in equal measure. He asked if she would come to a dinner that night to discuss a project. Maybe it was the way he eased the glass between his hands like a promise, but she accepted. He gave her a gift the way a man of means gives something vulnerable and precise. A camera, new, the kind of weight and balance that felt like a statement. Unboxing it at the foot of the penthouse couch, the leather strap smelling faintly of something clean and expensive, Elena's hands hovered. The camera didn't alter her world, but it offered tools she had always wanted. It reached into her life and made space for the kind of work that had made her keep shooting through unpaid afternoons and small shows where only relatives clapped. Full payment up front, Mateo said. It was neither a boast nor a test, it was a logistical fact. And freedom to work where you like. It was a small clause that mattered. Elena had learned to prize the ability to walk away. No one in this life should buy it for them. She nodded. Dinner that night felt like a scene measured in both light and silence. They sat across from each other under a chandelier that did not glare so much as shed a slow, merciful glow. Food came that was beautiful and not pretentious, each plate arranged as if the chef wanted to mask the flame with artistry. Between tastes, they traded stories in quick human bursts. Mateo, for all his reservedness, spoke once of a sister who had died in a way that was sharply private and softened his edges. Elena told him about Milo and a failed attempt at a darkroom in her apartment that had left the bathroom smelling of chemicals for days and made a permanent series of apologies to her cat. They laughed, softly, uneasily, at a joke about burnt pasta where Elena admitted, with theatrical shame, that her noodles usually ended up a little closer to charcoal than al dente. Mateo watched her as if he were cataloging the nuances of a new negative. There was respect in his attention, and also the smallest glint of something that might have been amusement. The dinner ended with an offer made without ceremony. He wanted photographs for an event, portraits, moments, candids. He wanted someone who saw things for the truth inside them, not just for the gloss. He asked her to help document a gathering he planned later that month, an assembly that would be half business, half ritual. There would be money, of course. There would also be exposure. And for a woman used to scraping a living from part-time gigs and the occasional commissioned piece, exposure felt like oxygen. "Work with me," he said, simply. "If you like trust, you get the cameras, you get the hours, and you get to go where the work requires." "What's the catch?" Elena asked, because she'd been raised on questions. "There's always a catch," he conceded, "but sometimes the catch is only a promise to keep. You won't be told what to photograph other than to be honest." She believed him. She could have walked away then. She had said yes before, in smaller ways. Say yes to a patron who could change the exhibition list. Say yes to a job that would pay rent this month. Saying yes to a man who could move people 3 offices down with a look was not the same. There was real risk folded inside the gift-wrapped camera and the warm voice asking her to be his documentarian. But Elena wasn't drawn by danger. She was drawn by the chance to make a photograph of something true. That and the strange quiet of Mateo when he listened, when he allowed slivers of his past and of himself to surface like fish in clean water. There was tenderness in that, an unexpected temperature she hadn't anticipated when she tapped send to Sophia's name. She accepted the job on her terms. He respected that. He respected all the small boundaries she set. She would keep her apartment, her shift at the cafe, Milo. She would not be a kept woman in soft focus. He agreed.
This exchange seemed, to both of them, a test of seriousness and of control. Back in her apartment that night, unboxing the camera again with the ridiculous domestic ritual of someone who loved new tools, Elena placed the strap around her neck and felt something shift. Milo regarded the new device with the sleepy disdain of feline royalty, then sniffed at the leather and decided it was not edible. She took a self-portrait in the small mirror above her sink. Not risque, not perfect, but honest, the way she wanted her life to be now. Messy, handled by her, owned. She told herself that the evening had been business. Matteo Duca, dangerous and precise, had been an employer. She had kept control of the conversation. She laughed softly at herself and admitted, in the way one admits a secret, that the night's surprise had been gentleness, an unexpected texture in a life that had been mostly survival. She did not like being surprised by people who moved like storms. In the days that followed, their arrangement fit into her routines in an almost natural way. He would text sparsely, arrangements, times, sometimes a recommendation for a film he thought she might like. She would reply with logistical updates or a photograph when she found one that felt too good not to share. He paid promptly. The camera arrived in her hands like a passport to something new. They established rhythms. She shot portraits in the afternoon when light angled the faces of people who stood without pretense. She edited in the evenings. She kept the cafe in the mornings, wearing her stained apron like a uniform that anchored her to the world she had chosen.
Matteo occasionally dropped by the cafe, once or twice unannounced, sitting at a corner table in silence. He moved through the room with the ease of a man who knows the cost of attention. Customers murmured. Sophia pretended not to be impressed, but arrested the conversation with a question about his preferred roast 3 times. They cooked for each other in small, awkward ways. Elena made burnt pasta twice in a week, first on purpose, or at least in an experiment that ended with charred noodles labeled as avant-garde. Matteo ate them with the intense focus of a man testing his own appetite for small disasters. He taught her to slice lemons the right way. She taught him where to hide emergency coffee beans in his office, a domestic revelation that made him laugh, small and rare and entirely human. The work itself turned into an oddly intimate observatory. Friends who had been invited to events under Matteo's roof were fascinated by the contrast between public performance and private truth. Elena photographed them the way a person loves someone from the inside, candid, sometimes unflattering, always searching for the ember beneath the spoke of charm they displayed. Her images began to circulate in the small gallery she trusted, and with Matteo's introductions, in places that mattered. Matteo began, slowly, to invite her into corners that were not business. He placed a hand at the small of her back in moments that would have felt possessive if not for how gently he guided. He confessed things in fragments, about a sister who had been everything to him and then like smoke. Elena listened the way she listened when someone told her a story that mattered, without flinching, with a steady curiosity that made him reveal more. She had, she told herself often, agency. She had terms. She chose to be there because it allowed her to photograph truths she had not yet had access to. She was not a prize to be won, not a wife to be owned. The camera sat between them like a silent arbiter, capturing, recording. Her decisions were hers, and she placed them on the table like coins you examine before you spend. On an ordinary Thursday, a man from Matteo's security, Vince, visited the cafe with a quiet nod. Elena had seen him once before, a shading presence in the background, the kind of man who made people feel watched without intending malice. He slipped a folder across the counter with an economy that made it clear the delivery itself was significant. Contained within were signs that someone else had taken an interest in Elena, emails she did not remember sending, logs of a credit card attempted to be used for a camera she hadn't yet purchased, a single entry noting a consultation with a small law firm. Elena's stomach clenched. The details read like a ledger of small invasions. Vince didn't comment. He waited until she had read the lines, the metadata row, the small notes at the bottom that some file had been traced to a corporate server registered to a legal firm downtown. He was professional, unshakable, and his eyes had the practiced softness of someone who had seen the consequences of curiosity before. "They wanted to make sure you came," he said finally. She felt, in that moment, both furious and oddly flattered. Someone was watching her. From the corner of the cafe, a man who always read the paper by the window looked up, then down, as if he had missed nothing and everything. Elena breathed and tasted coffee at the back of her tongue. "Thanks," she said to Vince. Her voice was steadier than she felt. She slid the folder into her bag with the casualness of a woman used to carrying too many weights. That night, alone in her kitchen with Milo glowering at the new camera case as if it were a foreign invader, she told herself this was part of the job. Being near someone like Matteo meant you carried fragments of his world. That world hummed with invisible lines of interest and danger. She had chosen it. She could leave. But curiosity is an anchor you can set for safety or to sink. Elena felt both tugged and moored. She had not known whether the photo she had sent, in a moment of Joker brazen self-love, would become a pivot. It had, regardless of intent. Matteo watched her from his own vantage, 2 floors up, eyes soft with a new consideration. He had ordered the background check not as a small indulgence, but as a way to push the shape of a puzzle into clarity. The results had been prosaic enough. She wasn't a mystery in need of being solved. She was a person who slipped into dangerous places because of curiosity, flawed and luminous. He liked that about her. He did not want to ruin that, and in the same breath, he also had to acknowledge the jealousy that tugged at the decision to hire her. It was a thing he hadn't expected, wanting to protect the edges of her life without smoothing them into something that was just his. He had been a man who could make things happen with a flick of a wrist. He would not make her his without permission, but he would make space for the permission to be given freely. For Elena, those early weeks were a test in the shape of slow, mundane choices. She photographed a man in a suit laughing with a woman who was not his wife, and watched the way light turned a lie into a soft thing. She developed one film by herself in the tiny space she'd converted into a darkroom, and cursed through a marathon of mistakes until an image came out that made her feel as if she touched something true. She took the camera into corners she had built around herself for years and didn't feel as if it was a tool of performance, but a way to record a new life as it unfolded. The city, too, seemed to notice. The skyline brightened and dimmed like the chest of a sleeping thing. The subway tasted of too much perfume and exhaust. Milo considered the box the camera had come in his new throne. Sophia declared, loudly, and with the conviction of a woman who thought every drama in Elena's life should be minced with popcorn, that the whole thing was a romance novel positioned badly in the stack of a life. But even with the laughter and the shoots, an undercurrent threaded through it, a line of attention from somewhere she could not see. Small things were out of place, an email that vanished, a social media post that didn't load on her phone, a person lingering too long to be a passerby. Elena kept records like a woman who feared memory's betrayals, saved emails, a folder in the cloud, contact logs. She was careful with passwords and wary of links she didn't expect. Human history had taught her that trust was both a kind of currency and a weapon. One evening, as she sat cross-legged on her small couch with a camera strap across her lap and a plate of disastrously burnt pasta cooling on the table, she couldn't keep the smile off her face. The job had paid well. Her work was being seen. Milo had approved of the strap. The world, for a breath, felt in order. She glanced at her phone. There were 2 new messages, one from Sophia with a gushing description of a new bar, and one from Matteo with a single photograph attached, an image he had asked her to take earlier in the week, of a girl laughing with her head thrown back in a way that made the shoulders relax and the eyes light. He had edited it himself. The caption read, "Good work." She laughed softly,
The kind of sound that comes from someone who knows they're alive in the very most ordinary sense of the word. Then, somewhere in the thread beneath that laugh, a shadow flickered. The kind of attention she had tried to ignore asserted itself in the margins. But for that night, with Milo purring and the camera warm against her skin, she allowed the small, explosive pleasure of being noticed to stand without being a hazard. In the days to come, the arrangement would require hard choices. There would be frictions and bounds. There would be small tests of will, whether to keep a shot, how to frame a stranger in a liar's face. For now, the camera was in her hands, the city in motion outside, and an invitation had been accepted. At the edge of everything, somewhere, a line was being pulled. Men in suits kept their mouths shut. A server somewhere in the Duca network ran a check that returned promising and inconclusive things. A law clerk in a downtown firm looked at her name and thought it strange. A man who had once loved her thought about how to control her again. But on the sidewalk below her apartment, Elena paused and looked up at the pale smear of city sky, breathed, and felt the weight of a choice sit in her like a coin in the palm. She had made it. She had accepted the work, the camera, the dinners, the strange, dangerous kindness of a man who could buy the night. She had done it on her terms. She also carried the knowledge now that things she could not predict had noticed her. It felt like the smallest, truest beat of dread, part of her wonder and part of the price. She put Milo's dinner down with a practiced flick, and then, for the first time in a long while, took an extra photograph of her own reflection. Imperfect, alive, the strap slung over her shoulder like a silent pact to herself. She would not be a prize. She would be a participant. The photograph that started it all rested in a folder on Mateo's phone, an accidental spark on his screen that had quietly led to an offer and a present and afternoons of burnt pasta. It had been a mistake. It had also been a movement towards something neither of them had named. As she drifted toward sleep that night, the city kept its slow melody, the distant wail of sirens, the soft thud of footsteps on the sidewalk. And she dreamed of light. The work was beginning. The camera was heavy in a way that felt honest. And in an office high above the river, Mateo closed his laptop with a small, decisive movement. He had made a quiet choice of his own, to let her go to her job, to let her keep her life. He had made offers and set boundaries. He had not yet crossed the line into possession. There would be time for that later, he thought, and perhaps it was better that way. For now, he would watch and pay attention. For now, he would use his resources to keep tabs, not to threaten. The world would not break on his watch, if he could help it. Outside, the city breathed and pulsed. Inside, the new camera case sat like a promise. Elena slept with her fingers curled around the strap, a small, private relic of autonomy. The incident that had begun as a mishap had not closed into neat consequence. It had instead opened into a life that would require decisions, courage, and the willingness to choose. A week later, a man Elena had once dated, whose name she had not wanted to speak aloud, but who lived like a shadow in the corners of small betrayals, sent a message she did not answer. It landed like a stone in a small pond and sent ripples she could not ignore. But the camera was in her hands, and the day had begun. She had work to do. The message from Jake sat like grit under Elena's teeth, a small, familiar ache she'd been trying not to touch. She had not replied. She had chosen silence the way people choose not to answer when a door creaks in a house and they're not sure whether to look. Silence, however, is not a solution that ages well. A week after the unreturned text, Vince arrived at the cafe with a different kind of folder. Heavier, official, a small plastic sleeve that held a printout and a thumb drive. He placed it on the counter with a deliberate calm that had become his signature. "This came from the team," he said. "Forensics ran the logs on your phone. We found something." Elena braced herself.
Milo, up on the counter in his cardboard throne, flicked an ear and judged the world with feline indifference. Vince did not mince. He told her, simply and without flourish, that there had been code on her phone, something that had slipped in months ago, masquerading as a link, a file, maybe a CV or a photo app update. It had been patient, a small program that siphoned call logs, messages, location pings. It sent snapshots of activity back to a server. The program had been clever enough to hide behind legitimate processes. It had been sloppy enough for an attentive forensic eye to track. Elena's stomach tightened. Who would do that? Vince laid the printouts down. An IP range, a registration tied to a small legal consultancy downtown, and a set of timestamps. The server registered under a shell company, he said. We traced payments to a lawyer's account. The name on the client file matches someone Mateo's people flagged last month. He didn't say the name. He didn't need to. Elena knew which ghost lived in margins like that. Jake, she whispered. Saying it made her feel both weak and furious. She had loved him once, enough to let him near her, enough that his close presence now felt like a brand that hadn't quite healed. He'd been quiet, powerful, in the ways of law firms and minor prestige. The kind of man who believed he could control a life with legal memos and gentle pressure. The idea that he would feed information to men whose names were murmured in halls like warnings made bile rise in Elena's throat. Vince watched her, measured. There's more, he said. We pulled location logs. There are anomalies, pings that placed your device near certain meetings at times you don't recall. The spyware could have been used to create a narrative, make it look like you were in conversations you never were. They could leak what they wanted when they wanted. Elena felt the floor tilt. She had kept meticulous records, backup photos, receipts, drafts of emails. But the idea someone could retrofit truth with spyware felt like an intrusion to the marrow. Her hands were still from habit, the old reflex of reaching for a camera, as if it could steady the shape of reality. Instead, she found herself gripping the folder Vince had given her until the paper whispered. "Do you think he did it?" she asked. Vince did not answer the question she wanted. He answered the one that mattered. Someone wanted you compromised. The trail points to people who might benefit from pitting you against Mateo. They're the kind who use leverage. You should decide how you want to respond. Elena left the cafe with the folder clenched under her arm like a fistful of proof. She could have gone to the police. She thought of that for a beat. But Mateo's world had a different shape. Involving law enforcement would not have been straightforward, and it might have put more people in danger.
She had chosen to step into Mateo's orbit. She wanted to solve this on terms that kept her life stitched together, not sliced apart. She decided to confront Jake. His downtown office sat in the kind of building that had been renovated into expensive neutralities. Glass, exposed beans, a lobby with succulents in pots that cost more than her rent. He greeted her with a smile that was too practiced, the sort of politeness that implied ownership. "Elena," he said, stepping out from behind a desk that was sturdier than a man needed it to be. "I didn't expect." "You didn't expect me to come," she said. Her voice did what it always did when it had to carry more than politeness. It steadied into the line of a camera's tripod. "I didn't expect you to put spyware on my phone, Jake." His face did something like a micro-expression, shock or calculation she couldn't be sure of. "That's ridiculous. Why would I?" "Because you wanted to know if I would do what you asked," she said. "Because you always thought you could steer me. Because you couldn't stand the idea of me making decisions that didn't fit your plan." Jake's palms opened in a soft, rhetorical gesture. "Elena, we could have talked about this. I care about you." "You cared about controlling me," she said. Saying it felt like ripping off a bandage. "You hooked me into your social orbit. You wanted to keep tabs. You think in memos and outcomes. I am not an outcome." He laughed then, short and brittle. You know nothing about what I do. People like what I work in. This is complicated. Everything you do is complicated because you refuse to be honest, she said. Who did you talk to? Who did you give access to? He was quiet for a long beat. I spoke to people who could help us. This isn't what you think. Who? She insisted. Names. He stepped closer, and for a second it felt like the past, the way he used to close the space between them with warm strategies. Elena's skin prickled. She pulled back a breath and held her ground. Some friends, he said, finally. People who can get things done. You gave them access to my life, she interrupted. And now I'm caught. Jake's face hardened. You were reckless sending that photo. Anger flared, bright and hot. I was human, she said. I made a mistake. I didn't make it to be weaponized against me. He looked at her then with something like pity. The pity of a man who thinks he knows how a woman should respond. You should be careful, he said, for your own sake. She stepped back. Something in his tone told her the conversation had already been decided. She reached into her bag and pulled out the folder Vince had given her, the forensic printouts. You worked with them, she said. Do you know what they'll do with my messages when they stitch them into their narrative? He blinked. You don't understand how this works. Then tell me, she said. Tell me now.
The look he gave her was not the one that meant apology. It was the look of a man who saw a chess piece move and had already plotted 6 responses. You don't have the receipts, he said. Even if you did, who would believe you? The server logs can be massaged. Elena's chest tightened. She had come because she wanted the truth. She had come because she had agency, because she wanted to gather evidence and put it somewhere that would hold. She had not come to be lectured. You're going to regret this, she said quietly. If you hand me over to people who want leverage, if you sell what I am to them, it will have consequences. Jake's smile returned, small and practiced. You should go now, Elena. You're making people nervous. She left and walked into the afternoon air like someone dropping a stone into deep water. Her hands shook long enough that she had to steady them with the camera strap across her shoulder. She had been careful. She had been honest. She had not expected the people who'd once loved her to be the ones who'd sell her to shadows. 2 days later, the cafe's morning bustle was interrupted by a crash of heat and motion. Elena had gone to the storage closet to fetch a spare bag of beans. The door she left ajar banged shut behind her. When she pushed it back open, 2 men were waiting. One tall and flat-faced, one shorter and quick. They wore the kind of anonymity that says training. Plain clothes, neutral shoes, voices that did not rise. Ms. Racy, the taller one asked, we want to talk. She saw through their neutrality. Something in the way they moved made the air in the room feel colder. The shorter man gestured with a notepad that flashed like a sign of legality. We represent individuals who believe you have information about them, he said. It's only a conversation. Elena's brain moved faster than the polite scripts she'd rehearsed. Her first thought was leave, call Mateo, call Vince, but her phone screen was a small lit rectangle that felt suddenly too fragile to hold anything important. She realized with a cold clarity that she had been followed. Jake's message had not gone unanswered in the eyes of those who wanted to own the narrative. Not here, she said. I don't talk in front of customers. The men exchanged a look. We can make arrangements, the tall one said. Behind the counter, Sophia looked up with an expression that would have been comical if it were edged with fear. Milo flattened his ears. Elena's choices shrank to a handful of actions. She could refuse and call Mateo outright. She could run, but for a woman whose life had been insisted on as small by others, running felt like an erasure. She chose to walk with the men.
The choice was not bravery, it was a measure of control. She would step where she was being led instead of being yanked. It was the smallest form of agency she could find in that moment. They drove her to a building that smelled of damp concrete and cheap paint.
Inside, a man who introduced himself as Marco Calibre sat behind a metal folding table. He was shorter than she had expected, leaner, with eyes that measured for profit. Elena had seen him once at an event Matteo had photographed. A ripple of a presence, the sort of man who let other men make the loud moves and cut their own deals. "Ms. Racy," Marco said, with the neutral politeness of the man who knows how to be both a businessman and a threat. "We have questions." "You have no right," she began. "You were careless," Marco interrupted. "You sent something that implicated people we care about. We want to know whether you did so on purpose." Elena's temper boiled over. "You think I sent something to ruin you on purpose? I'm not a plot point in your ledger." The room grew taut. The shorter man who had driven her slammed a fist on the table as if to emphasize that words mattered less than outcomes. "Talk, or the outcome changes," Marco said. He did not say what the change would be. He did not have to. Elena felt the air close in. She tried to argue about technical evidence, about timeline, about Jake. She offered names, dates, proof she had collected in her little folder. Marco listened like a man listening to TV static, picking out the parts that might be valuable later. His eyes kept flicking to a side door where people came and went. Elena realized suddenly that she was not just being questioned, she was being used as insurance. The idea landed like a stone in her stomach. When the shorter man mentioned Matteo, his voice changed. "If Duca moves wrong," he said, "you'll make sure he understands he can't cross us." Elena inhaled and tasted metal. "I didn't." But saying it meant nothing. In the end, she learned what leverage felt like. Not a threat made loudly, but a slow unspooling of options. They took her phone. They kept her overnight in a room that smelled faintly of mildew. The world outside turned and did not stop for the small injustices of one waitress. The first time they came at her, it was with words. The men asked about Matteo's plans, about the room he intended to fill with certain people. When she said she didn't know, they used the old tactic of humiliation, name her friends, remind her of debts, tell her the smaller unkindnesses that make people compliant. She refused. She demanded to call someone. They refused. They told her she would sit until a message came that pleased them. When the first blow landed, an ugly slap that had no purpose other than to score her face, Elena felt something in her chest give. It wasn't the shock of pain, it was the burial of a part of herself that hadn't expected to be treated like a thing to be broken. She suffered it the way one suffers being knocked off a bike, with the knowledge that standing would be a different, harsher task. It was during that night that she understood the cost of being seen. Being noticed by powerful men had introduced her to attention that did not separate admiration from ownership. She understood, with brutal clarity, that the camera that had made her visible could be turned into a bargaining chip. Back at the penthouse, Matteo's phone did not sleep. Vince had transmitted the movement, a sudden drop in chatter from a certain server, an anomalous ping, then silence. Matteo's gut, an animal intelligence that had kept his world from falling into cracks, tightened. He had seen trades take ugly turns before. He had seen favors turned into iron. He read Vince's message and made one call, then another. He did not dress slowly. He did not compose. When he arrived at the Caliber warehouse, he came with a plan that was practical and terrible in its efficiency. He moved like a man who had spent his life practicing certain brutal arts, removing obstacles, ensuring survival. He had a crew, but he did not let them lead. He went in with the kind of precision that would have pleased a surgeon. The warehouse smelled of grease and wet wood.
Men moved with the lazy confidence of those who thought power would hold them steady. They did not expect Mateo. They did not expect the orchestration that came with a man who had been taught to buy the right silence. The assault was quick. Vince and a handful of trusted men on the perimeter, Mateo in the center like a prow. There were flashes of motion, doors being kicked, hands being grabbed, the sound of bodies suppressed. Mateo did not savor violence. He used it as a tool. He found Elena in a room with the neon residue of emergency exit signs, face bruised but unbowed. When she saw him, something in her face broke and reassembled in the span of a second. Relief, fury, an old self that had been both terrified and practical. He reached for her first as a man reaching for the only thing that mattered. "Elena," he said, and the word carried 1,000 small salvations. She wanted, for a second, to scream. Instead, she wrapped her hand around the camera strap that had never left her neck and let him take her. The quiet that followed was not gentle. It was a rearrangement of priorities. She wanted to ask why he had not prevented this. He wanted to tell her that he had tried, and that he had not known how far Jake had been willing to go. Words felt useless. Mateo's face in the dim light did not show triumph. It showed an admission of something raw. He was not a man who said he was sorry easily. There, in that warehouse, he did not have to say it. He could protect her with action. They left quickly. The calibers had not been completely routed. Enemies rarely were, but the message had been sent. Mateo's handlers took names, Vince collected what documents they could, and forensic techs later pulled what remained from the scene. The men in the glossy suits who had been used to moving with quiet arrogance would remember the night when someone came for what belonged to them.
In the hours after the rescue, Elena lay on the penthouse couch wrapped in a blanket that smelt faintly of Mateo's jacket. He had driven her home because she had refused to let him hover. She had wanted to sleep in the apartment that still contained burned pasta and Milo. He had insisted she come to a place where he could watch the door. She looked at him then, not as a protector, but as an invitation. He was a man who had saved her life with the kind of violence she wished had never been required, and she felt the complicated gratitude that comes when someone puts their life on the line for you. She understood, in an inward, private way, that his actions did not erase the damage. She also understood that he might, with enough time and care, help her rebuild the parts stolen from her. They did not make love that night. There was no cinematic reprieve. There were first aid kits and painkillers and a long, careful conversation in which he asked questions and she answered, and she told him about the ways Jake had been in the background of her life. She told him, too, how it felt to be looked at like an object and how she had always fought to be anything but. He listened with the sort of attention that had once been used for business and now softened into something like tenderness. "I'm sorry," he said at last, the words simple enough to be almost awkward in his mouth. He had learned to use them like tools rather than flourishes. "I should have known." "You didn't know," she said. "You did what you could when you did know. That counts." He stared at the ceiling, then let out a slow breath. "I don't want to own you, Elena. That isn't why I did it. But I can't pretend that I wasn't furious. At others and at myself. I promised I'd keep you safe, and when I couldn't, it felt like failure." Elena thought of the choices she had made that day, walking to Jake's office, refusing to be quiet, surviving, and felt the truth of her own resilience. "Protection isn't about being caged," she said. "It's about giving me the tools to be who I am." He nodded. It was more a concession than a victory. "I know," he said, "and I want to learn how to do that better." Their recovery was not immediate. In the weeks that followed, Mateo negotiated with a kind of diplomacy that looked more like buying peace and less like conquest. He sat at tables with men who had been enemies and made offers that would keep bodies out of hallways. He'd always been capable of deals. He was now capable of making them with an earnest desire to stop the cyclical violence he'd watched consume people he cared about.
Jake's role, meanwhile, unfurled in the daylight. Vince and Mateo's team had enough to make a complicated case. Logs that indicated money trail, correspondences, and a recorded confession that came from a meeting where Jake tried to bargain his way out with promises that compromised his leverage. He was not killed. He was exposed, humiliated, and cut loose from the network he'd used. For Elena, watching the fallout was a strange blend of vindication and pity. She had loved him, and she had also been betrayed by him. In the end, his decisions had consequences that were not cinematic punishments, but social discredit and a collapse of the little empire he had built of influence. The Calibre family took their own price. Mateo sat across from Marco in a neutral room and offered terms: retirement of a middleman, a small dispersal of assets that solved immediate anger, and a public peace that would, they hoped, keep guns in holsters and men in chairs rather than in action. Mateo's bargaining was clinical. He walked the line between threat and proposal with the skill of someone who had negotiated away wars. He offered exchanges that acknowledged cost. In return, Marco and his brothers accepted terms that kept their lives intact but limited their reach. It should have been a tidy end. It was never tidy. On their way back from the table where the peace had been reluctantly agreed, Mateo and Elena's convoy moved through a narrow stretch of highway that cut along the river. The drive had been almost celebratory, a small release after the months of tension. Elena sat in the SUV, camera on her lap, Milo curled in the carrier at her feet. She held Mateo's hand across the center console. It felt like the most ordinary performance of something deeply earned. Then the world broke into fragments of glass and sound. They did not see it coming. A truck slid across the highway in a calculated strike, forcing them off balance. Men appeared with a speed that felt choreographed. Bullets ricocheted, the driver swore. Vince's team countered, but the attackers had planned for an ambush. Mateo's body moved through muscle memory. He ducked, pushed Elena down, grabbed hold of the wheel. The world was panic and the smell of rubber and the loud, metallic screaming of impact. In the narrow chaos of the attack, Elena felt the camera in her hands like an absurd talisman. It was an object that had survived more than she had. A man lunged toward Mateo's window. For a half-second, Elena had a single absurd idea. The camera could be more than a recorder. She unhooked the strap and threw the body of the camera like a stone. It hit with a sickening thump against the attacking man's face. The man staggered backward, dazed. In those seconds, Mateo found a pocket of safety and leverage. Vince's men closed ranks, and drivers wrestled vehicles away from the planned wreck. Mateo's hand caught Elena's fingers and squeezed. He didn't curse her for throwing the camera. He didn't have the space to be angry. He had the space only to be grateful. They survived the ambush with bruises and adrenaline, and with the camera a little more dented but functional.
Later, in the quiet aftermath, Mateo would call the throw an odd kind of heroism. Elena would call it a reflex born of years of learning to tell truth. The ambush changed the tenor of their peace. It reminded everyone, Mateo included, how close the edges could be. Negotiations resumed, but this time with an awareness that gestures would have to be backed by enforcement. Marco Calibre, chastened, accepted more stringent terms. Mateo agreed to retire a long-standing arm of his network, not as a surrender, but as a concession that better scaled the cost of conflict. The result was an uneasy but durable arrangement that removed the immediate threat and made the city marginally safer. In the slow weeks that followed, Elena tended to recovery and to work. She insisted on keeping both. Mateo insisted on learning the careful art of not deciding for her, which sometimes looked like awkward fumbling, texting to ask where she wanted to be during a day, asking permission before making a plan, and letting her say no without pressure. There were missteps. Old habits do not die simply because one recognizes them, but there were also small changes that mattered more than performances. They cooked together again.
Elena burned pasta once and then learned to laugh at herself instead of wishing the worst. Milo climbed into the sink one afternoon during a shoot and knocked a roll of film into water. They rescued the negatives together, hands sticky and laughing, and Mateo's amusement at a ruined roll of film felt less like indulgence and more like delight. The trust between them did not rebound overnight. There were nights when Elena woke up thinking of the warehouse, the smells, the sound of boots on concrete. There were nights when Mateo lay awake worrying that his world had cost her pieces of herself. They slept with a small ritual. She would always take her phone into the bedroom and show him the lock screen, the messages, the saved files. It was a small ceremony of transparency. Professionally, Elena's work blossomed in a way she had not expected. The trauma did not make her art mawkish. If anything, it refined its focus. She photographed Mateo's world in a way that did not romanticize it. She caught small, unguarded things, a hand hovering over a coffee cup, a laugh that did not reach the eyes, Mateo alone on a balcony looking out at the river. People began to see the truth in her pictures, the quiet human parts of lives that were otherwise loud. This did not make Mateo into a safer man by magic. His world remained dangerous. His choices continued to have consequences. He chose, however, to make the costs more expensive for those who would hurt the people he cared about. He chose, more importantly, to step back sometimes and let Elena be more than an adjunct to his life. He answered her when she demanded space and made sure his protectiveness was not a leash. Months passed. The peace held because it had been negotiated with enough teeth to be credible. The city exhaled. Elena opened a small studio in a strip of neighborhood that still smells a little of paint and possibility. It was modest, a back room that she refurbished with the money Mateo had helped her earn and the energy she had put into evenings and weekends. She hung her work on the walls, including one photograph that no one else had seen in years, the accidental image that had started everything, printed in small, tasteful proportions and framed in a simple black frame. She had been tempted not to display it at all. Instead, she chose to place it where everyone could see that accidents could be formative and that mistakes did not always end in ruin. Opening night arrived with the small, quiet electricity of a milestone that had been earned. Friends crowded into the studio, murmuring appreciations and offering clumsy compliments. Sophia made a joke about the burnt pasta that had everyone laughing. Milo wandered through on a lead and seemed to approve of the soft light. Mateo arrived late, as he always did, and stood in a doorway watching the room fold around Elena. There was a pride in his posture that had nothing to do with ownership. He looked genuinely like someone who appreciated another person's achievement. After the crowd had thinned and the string lights dimmed, Mateo took her hand. They walked through the photographs, stopping at the framed print. Her shoulder caught in golden light, the same composition of the original accidental message, now deliberate, now turned into evidence of a life redirected. "You kept it," Mateo said. She ran a thumb across the glass. "It was always mine," she replied. "It was a mistake that taught me something." He paused then, and for a long second the city's noise felt far away. "There's a choice I want to offer you," he said softly. "Not a demand, not a promise to fix what can't be fixed, just a choice." Elena looked at him. He had given her choices before, and they'd been as practical as offers of work. This was different. There was love, but it was not a bartering chip. "If you stay, I want to be with you. I want to—" His phrase stumbled, the way big men sometimes do when naming small things. "I want to be someone who lets you be whole. There's a lot I will have to adjust. There will be costs." Her mouth quirked, the old half-smile that could be sarcastic or tender. "This is the part where I tell you that I won't be a kept thing in a room, and you tell me you wouldn't dream of it." He smiled back, slower now. "I would never dream of keeping you, but I would like to be someone you pick." She considered. She remembered Jake's performative control, the warehouse, the burnt pasta, the camera she had flung like a small, decisive weapon. She thought of the way Mateo's hands had steadied her in the dark, and the way he had argued with men who had tried to hold her like a ledger.
She thought of the way her work had grown when she wasn't hiding. She thought of Milo, of little domestic victories, of the studio and the framed photograph. "I'll choose," she said finally, "but it will be on my terms." Mateo exhaled like a man who had been offered a map and decided to follow it. "Name them." They walked through them like a contract: space for her work, days he would not intrude, the right to refuse requests that felt like demands, a public acknowledgement that she was her own person. Mateo agreed without the old smugness that had once been his armor. He promised, too, to step back when she asked. Hard to do in his world, but he tried, and at times failed, and tried again. A year later, on a bright, windy day, Elena walked down a narrow aisle in her small studio and into a backyard that Mateo had quietly arranged to be theirs for the afternoon. They had invited close friends and a handful of family-like presences. Vince stood with a plate of grilled things at the edge, and Sophia had arranged a playlist that made people laugh and cry at the same time. Milo, elegant and indifferent, wore a tiny collar with a bell. They exchanged rings on a small wooden table beneath strings of lights. They said vows that were frank and unshowy, no big speeches, only small promises about trust and space and honesty. There was no theatrical fall into a romanticized fantasy. There was a commitment formed from daily choices, the kind of covenant that honored histories and refused the gloss of myth. Afterward, when the crowd had thinned to a few loyal friends, they went to the studio. Elena stood in front of the framed accidental photograph and traced a finger along the frame. "It still surprises me," she said, "how something so stupid could change everything." Mateo took her hand. "Sometimes the worst accidents become interesting because we let them be," he said, "because we choose what they become." She smiled, a small, private grin that invited the world in and kept it at the same time. "Is it perfect?" she asked. "No," he said, "it isn't, but it's ours." They left the studio with the original photograph digitized and framed on the wall. Milo walked between their ankles like a small, imperious witness. The city outside kept its noises: sirens, the hum of traffic, someone arguing on a sidewalk. But inside, they had built a quieter world anchored by choices and by a camera that had done more than record. It had witnessed. On the sill of the studio window, she kept Mateo's first text to her saved. A laconic, astonishing line. Interesting choice of lighting. It no longer felt like a brick. It felt like the first note in a long, complicated song. At the end of that night, when lights were low and Milo had fallen asleep on a shelf of prints, they sat together and scrolled through messages. Elena pointed to the frame with fingers that had steadied into a habit of intimacy. "Team Mateo or Team Runaway?" she teased, remembering how the internet loved to annotate private lives. Mateo leaned back, smiling that small, precise smile she had come to like. "Team done with running," he said. "Team built something better." She laughed softly and flicked her phone, the trace of the old panic long gone. The world had shifted around them, not perfectly, but with enough softness to make space for them both. If you loved this messy, dangerous, tender kind of story, tell me which side you're on, Team Mateo or Team Runaway. Comment below and let us know.